Welcome back to The Explainer. Today we are unpacking an absolutely massive one. We're going to dive into one of the most epic, chaotic, and globally transformative 70-year narratives in all of human history, the rise and fall of the Soviet Union. We're going to trace this monumental shift using the data, the timelines, and the maps from our source material to really try and understand how an entirely new world order was built completely from scratch, only to completely crumble to pieces a few decades later. It's a story that honestly directly explains why the map of Europe looks exactly the way it does for us today.
It really is the ultimate historical mystery, right? How does an empire covering literally 1/6 of the Earth's land area just vanish in only 70 years? To understand this, we have to rewind to the eve of World War I. The Russian Empire had been ruled for 3 centuries by the Romanov dynasty, and it was unbelievably massive. I mean, it boasted the largest army in the world with about 6 million soldiers, and its industry was totally booming. Steel, coal, oil, you name it. But beneath that surface-level strength, it was incredibly fragile. Over 170 million people lived there, and the vast majority of them were extremely poor, ill-equipped peasants.
Okay, let's dive right into Chapter 1, the birth of the Soviet Union, from 1914 to 1922, a completely chaotic era that kicks off with the sudden collapse of a 300-year-old dynasty. So, when World War I breaks out, it is an absolute, unmitigated disaster for Russia. The Romanov Empire is left bleeding out, you've got millions of starving peasants, and a stubborn provisional government wasting resources in the freezing trenches. Inflation is skyrocketing, and everyday civilian needs are just completely ignored. And stepping right into this massive, chaotic void is Vladimir Lenin and the Bolshevik Party. They looked at this desperate population and offered them radical, almost irresistible promises. They said, "We will give you immediate peace, we will redistribute the land to the peasants, and we'll give workers control of the factories." They even promised equality for minorities. You can easily see how they caught fire, gained the support of a furious population, successfully seized power, and pulled Russia right out of the global war.
But, as you might guess, that Bolshevik takeover triggered an incredibly bloody civil war. You had independent militias, white armies backed by foreign powers, and peasant green armies all clashing with Lenin's newly reorganized Red Army. By the time the dust finally settled and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR, was officially proclaimed in December 1922, the toll was just staggering. 8%. Let that sink in for a second. After 8 years of global and civil war, 8% of the entire pre-war population had died. The country was completely devastated, leaving something like 7 million orphans just roaming the streets.
Which brings us to Chapter 2, Stalin and Total War. This is a brutal era that completely and violently reshaped the entire nation.
Following Lenin's death in 1924, Joseph Stalin steps up, dismisses his rivals, and seizes absolute control. And he has this ruthless, singular obsession: rapid industrialization. But to fund these grand industrial dreams, Stalin violently forced the collectivization of agriculture. He basically expropriated land from the peasants, forcing them into these massive state-run communities called kolkhozes. Now, when people naturally resisted this, the state's answer was the gulags. This was a massive government system managing forced labor camps in the most remote, freezing, hostile areas of the country, places like Siberia. Prisoners were shipped off to build railroads and mine coal in just awful conditions. Meanwhile, Stalin confiscated crops from peasants he accused of sabotage, purposely condemning millions to starvation in places like Ukraine and Kazakhstan.
Now let's track the terrifying diplomatic timeline leading right into World War II. In 1939, Stalin is isolated and terrified of a two-front war, so he signs a shock non-aggression pact with Nazi Germany. They secretly divide up Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. But talk about a masterclass in diplomatic backfiring. Stalin completely underestimated the threat he had just bargained with. Even though his own spies were warning him of an imminent attack, he just flat out refused to believe it. Then, on June 22, 1941, Germany breaks the pact. They launched the largest military offensive in human history directly into the USSR. The Red Army was taken totally by surprise and was just completely overwhelmed.
Now, what's really interesting about the data here is just the sheer human endurance required to survive what came next. 872 days. That is exactly how long the German siege of Leningrad lasted. Faced with total destruction, Stalin ordered a scorched earth policy and basically turned the entire remaining population into a massive war production machine. The resistance was unbelievably fierce, but the cost? Horrific. That 872-day siege alone was fatal for more than 1 million civilians.
And further south, in Stalingrad, an average of 6,000 Soviets died every single day for 5 months just to defend the city. Eventually, though, they managed to surround and defeat 300,000 German soldiers in what really became the major turning point of the entire war.
So, the Soviet counteroffensives relentlessly push all the way to Berlin. They eventually win the war in Europe and then swiftly turn east to force Japan's capitulation. But looking at the numbers, the paradox of this victory is just staggering. On one hand, the human tragedy was literally apocalyptic. Over 26 million total dead, including 10 million soldiers, with tens of millions more left permanently displaced. It's almost hard to comprehend. Yet geopolitically, the USSR emerges from the ashes as a sprawling, untouchable global superpower. They seize vast new territories in Asia and Europe, they occupy Eastern Germany, and they fundamentally redraw the world map entirely in their favor.
And that redrawn map leads us straight into Chapter 3, The Cold War Escalates. Welcome to a deeply divided world.
So the crucial point is that with the war over, Stalin made sure pro-Soviet governments were set up all across Eastern Europe to act as a buffer zone. The United States obviously pushes back against this, and the old continent finds itself split right down the middle. This standoff between the US and the Soviets quickly escalates from a political dispute into a frantic, high-stakes race for existential survival. Just track this timeline with me. In 1949, the USSR successfully tests its first atomic bomb. Boom. Then, when West Germany joins NATO, the Soviets counter in 1955 by creating their own military alliance, the Warsaw Pact. By 1957, they absolutely shock the Americans by sending the very first satellite into space, kicking off the space race. And by 1961, the Berlin Wall goes up, a literal concrete barrier to stop people from fleeing the East for the West.
Following Stalin's death in 1953, a new leader, Nikita Khrushchev, attempts a dramatic pivot. His new strategy? Appeasement. He actually fundamentally changed the internal fabric of the USSR. He released over 1 million prisoners, developed new agriculture in the steppes of Kazakhstan and Siberia, and massively accelerated apartment construction so everyday citizens could actually have proper homes. He even shocked his own party with a secret report denouncing Stalin's brutal excesses. But actually, scratch that. Don't let the word appeasement fool you entirely, because when anti-communist revolts broke out in Hungary shortly after this, Khrushchev didn't hesitate for a single second to send in Soviet tanks to completely crush the uprising.
Let's move to the next phase and see how this builds to what is arguably the most terrifying climax of the entire Cold War. The United States installed nuclear missiles in Italy and Turkey, which directly threatened the USSR. So how does Khrushchev respond? He allies with Cuba and secretly arms the island with Soviet missiles pointing right at America. The whole world basically held its breath. We were quite literally days away from global nuclear annihilation. Thankfully, at the end of the day, neither side actually wanted to pull the trigger and end the world. It resulted in a mutual, highly relieved withdrawal agreement. They stepped back from the absolute brink.
When Leonid Brezhnev takes power after Khrushchev is ousted in 1964, the Soviet Union enters this really fascinating era of grand illusion. To the outside world, it looked like an unstoppable military juggernaut. Brezhnev invested heavily in defense, rolling out massive new nuclear missiles that threatened Western Europe and violently putting down liberalization reforms in Czechoslovakia. But internally, that outward might was masking a devastating reality: severe economic stagnation. While the military is out there parading its power, domestic agricultural and industrial production are quietly grinding to a halt. The country was slowly starving its own economy just to fund its weapons programs.
Which brings us to our final chapter. The empire collapses. This is the final act of a 70-year superpower. By the time Mikhail Gorbachev comes to power in 1985, the cracks in the foundation are simply way too wide to ignore anymore. A really disastrous foreign policy move in 1979 had sent Soviet armies into Afghanistan, where they quickly got bogged down in an incredibly expensive, highly unpopular war. So Gorbachev inherits a nation whose coffers are totally drained and an economy in absolute freefall. And then, as if that wasn't enough, this catastrophe is compounded a year later by the horrific 1986 Chernobyl nuclear disaster. This plunges him into even deeper financial and diplomatic holes. He tried to save the state by introducing policies of transparency and openness, but honestly, his reforms actually just made it easier for angry, exhausted citizens to organize. And this led to massive nationwide strikes against the failing system.
And this brilliantly illustrates the rapid, completely unstoppable chain reaction that tore the Union apart for good. Communist regimes across Eastern Europe start falling one by one. Sensing Moscow's sudden weakness, Lithuania boldly proclaims its independence, and other Soviet republics very quickly follow suit. By July 1991, the Warsaw Pact officially dissolves, and finally, out of options, totally out of money, and having narrowly survived a coup attempt, Mikhail Gorbachev resigns on Christmas Day 1991. With a single stroke of a pen, the Soviet Union simply ceased to exist.
All of which leaves us with a really fascinating question to ponder. How do the echoes of the Soviet Union's rapid rise and sudden collapse continue to shape our world map today? I mean, from the highly contested borders of Eastern Europe to the intense geopolitical rivalries that are still dominating our news feeds right now, the legacy of this 70-year historical arc heavily dictates modern global politics. It is a really stark reminder of how quickly seemingly permanent empires can rise to power and exactly how suddenly they can vanish. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer today. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll see you next time.